January 1944. High above central Germany, the air is thin and brittle with cold. American B-17 bombers turn west, their aluminum skins scarred by flak. Smoke trails drift behind them, slow and dark, marking where men were lost minutes earlier. For German fighter pilots, this moment had long meant relief. The intercept was over. Fuel was low. Ammunition spent. The bombers were leaving. But today, something stays with them. Far beyond the target cities, beyond the last expected escort line, silver fighters remain glued to the bomber formations. They do not peel away. They do not turn back. They press closer instead, slipping into position with unnerving patience. German pilots glance at their fuel gauges, at the horizon, at the unfamiliar shape pacing them home. These are not the short-legged escorts they were used to. These aircraft follow relentlessly, across rivers, forests, rail yards, deep into airspace that was once considered safe. The laughter that once greeted American escorts has faded. And in its place is a realization spreading cockpit to cockpit. The journey home has become the most dangerous part of the mission. That realization did not arrive suddenly. It was forged through years of doctrine, loss, and desperate adaptation. A story that begins long before the Mustang ever crossed the German border. When the United States entered the Second World War in December 1941, its vision of air power was already rigidly defined. American military planners believed in daylight strategic bombing, not harassment raids, not terror attacks. Precision strikes, industrial paralysis from the sky. Factories, rail hubs, oil refineries. The machinery of war itself would be dismantled from above, in clear daylight, by tightly organized bomber formations. This doctrine was built around the belief that bombers could defend themselves. The Boeing B-17, Flying Fortress, and the consolidated B-24 Liberator bristled with machine guns. Their overlapping fields of fire, planners argued, would form an airborne fortress impossible to penetrate. Fighters would assist at the edges, but deep inside enemy territory, bomber formations would protect their own. It was a theory shaped in classrooms and exercises, not over Germany. By 1942, the 8th Air Force was operating from Britain, launching daylight raids against occupied Europe. Early missions seemed to validate the concept. Losses were manageable. German defenses appeared disorganized. The bomber stream moved with confidence. But as targets pushed deeper into the Reich, reality began to intrude. German air defense was not improvised. It was layered, rehearsed, and lethal. Radar stations along the coast detected incoming formations. Controllers vectored fighters with precision. Flak batteries ringed every major industrial city, filling the sky with timed explosions. And waiting above the bombers were experienced pilots flying aircraft designed for interception. The Luftwaffe had been built for this exact role. Messerschmitt Bf-29s and Fokker Wolf W-90s climbed quickly, struck hard, and disengaged. Pilots attacked from head-on angles, where bomber guns were weakest, closing at terrifying speed. Cannons tore through aluminum and flesh alike. The bomber formations held, but at a cost. By late 1942 and early 1943, losses began to spike. Missions to Wilhelmshaven, Bremen, and Kiel returned with gaps in their formations, empty spaces where aircraft had been. The true breaking point came in 1943. On August 17, American bombers struck the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and the aircraft assembly plants at Regensburg. It was a mission designed to cripple German industry. Instead, it revealed the limits of bomber self-defense. German fighters attacked relentlessly, over and over, from takeoff to withdrawal. By the time the surviving bombers limped back to England, 60 aircraft were gone, 600 men missing or dead. The statistics were undeniable. At that loss rate, the bombing campaign could not be sustained. The escort fighters tasked with protecting the bombers had done what they could, but their reach was limited. The Republic P-47. Thunderbolt was powerful and rugged, but it consumed fuel at a punishing rate. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning had range, but suffered from mechanical issues in the cold, thin air over Europe. Both aircraft were forced to turn back long before the bombers reached their targets, and German pilots knew it. They timed their attacks carefully, waiting for the escorts to peel away. Then they struck the bomber formations with near impunity, confident that once the fighters left, the sky belonged to them. By the end of 1943, American air commanders faced a stark choice. Either abandon daylight bombing or find a fighter that could follow the bombers all the way there and all the way home. The solution was already flying. But few believed it mattered. That belief would soon be challenged. The aircraft that would change the air war over Europe did not arrive with fanfare. In fact, when the P-51 Mustang first appeared in 1942, it was barely noticed by the very people who would later depend on it. Designed by North American Aviation in response to a British requirement, the Mustang was originally conceived as a ground attack and reconnaissance aircraft, not a long-range escort, and certainly not a Luftwaffe killer. Its early performance reflected that reality. Powered by the Allison V1710 engine, the initial Mustang variants performed well at low and medium altitudes, but lost power above 15,000 feet. Precisely where bomber combat occurred, American commanders viewed it as marginal, even disappointing. German pilots who encountered it rarely took it seriously. They had reason to be confident. The Luftwaffe had already faced American escorts and survived. The P-47 was fast, but thirsty. The P-38 was dangerous in capable hands, but unreliable. Neither stayed long enough to alter the rhythm of German interceptions. The Mustang seemed no different. What changed its fate was not an American decision, but a British one. Royal Air Force test pilots, always searching for improvements, fitted the Mustang with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The transformation was immediate and profound. With the Merlin's two-stage supercharger, the aircraft retained power at high altitude, gaining speed, climb rate, and operational ceiling. More importantly, it did so with exceptional fuel efficiency. The redesigned P-51 could fly farther than any American fighter before it. When fitted with external drop tanks, it could escort bombers deep into Germany and still have fuel to fight. Yet even then, acceptance came slowly. American procurement officers were cautious. Production lines had already been committed. Training pipelines favored familiar aircraft. And escort doctrine itself was still evolving. Fighters were expected to stay close, not roam freely. But desperation accelerates change. By late 1943, mounting bomber losses forced commanders to experiment. The first Merlin-powered P-51B and P-51C Mustangs arrived in England. Their pilots were given a new task: stay with the bombers for as long as possible, then stay longer. The difference was felt almost immediately. For the first time, German radar operators saw fighter escorts still present deep over the Reich. Luftwaffe pilots climbing to intercept expected the familiar moment when the escorts turned away. It did not come. Mustangs stayed high, conserving fuel, watching patiently. When German fighters attacked the bombers, the Mustangs dove with speed and precision. They did not merely defend, they hunted. Still, skepticism lingered. Some German pilots dismissed the Mustang as fragile. Too light. Too thin-skinned. Others saw it as just another temporary nuisance. They believed endurance would decide the war in the air, and Germany had endured before. But endurance relies on patterns. And by early 1944, those patterns were beginning to break. American fighters were no longer guests in German airspace. They were becoming a constant presence. And that presence would soon be felt from the moment bombers crossed the coast, to the moment surviving German pilots turned for home. That shift set the stage for a confrontation not just of machines, but of expectations. For American bomber crews, survival had always depended on distance. The farther the escort reached, the greater the odds of coming home. Before the Mustang, there was a moment every crewman recognized. The slow, sinking feeling when friendly fighters turned away. Gunners watched them peel off, wings rocking in farewell, knowing what followed. Silence. Then attack. With the arrival of the P-51, that moment began to disappear. Gunners scanning the sky noticed something unfamiliar. American fighters still there, weaving above the formation long after the target had been bombed. Pilots felt it too. The tension inside the cockpit shifted. Not removed, never removed, but redistributed. The bombers were still vulnerable. Flak still tore aircraft apart, but the sense of abandonment was gone. Letters home reflected it. Crews wrote of fighters that stayed, of escorts that followed them all the way in. Casualty statistics soon echoed the emotional change. Losses did not vanish, but they stabilized. For men flying missions with survival odds measured in weeks, that mattered. The tactical angle, breaking the interception rhythm. German interception doctrine had been built on predictability. Fighters climbed, formed up, attacked, disengaged, and landed. Each phase was calculated around fuel limits and escort withdrawal points. The bombers were not the true target. The unescorted bombers were. The Mustang disrupted that rhythm. Its range allowed American commanders to push escorts beyond previous boundaries. Fighters no longer clung tightly to the bombers. Instead, they patrolled above and ahead, diving on interceptors before attacks could be organized. German pilots found themselves forced into defensive reactions rather than controlled assaults. Every climb became dangerous. Every regrouping exposed. And crucially, the return flight, once considered safe, was now contested airspace. The enemy angle. German expectations. Early encounters with the Mustang did not inspire fear. German pilots had faced new Allied aircraft before. Most were manageable. The Mustang's light construction and laminar flow wing led some to believe it would break easily under cannon fire. But repeated engagements revealed something else. It did not need to outturn German fighters. It did not need to outclimb them. It simply stayed longer. It waited. And when German aircraft disengaged low on fuel, Mustangs were still overhead. The confidence that once followed a successful intercept began to erode. Because the fight was no longer ending over the target. it was following them home. That realization marked the first crack in Luftwaffe certainty, a crack that would widen as the war pressed forward. And with it came deeper consequences that reached beyond the cockpit into leadership decisions, technology, and morale itself. The P-51 Mustang was more than a fighter. It was a revolution in endurance. With drop tanks and the Merlin engine, it could accompany bombers from the English coast deep into the industrial heart of Germany. Over Brunswick, Leipzig, or Frankfurt, German pilots, once confident in their home advantage, found themselves confronted by an American fighter that had not yet expended its energy, ammunition, or resolve. Speed, altitude, and range combined into a persistent threat. Unlike earlier escorts, which were forced to turn back, the Mustang could choose its engagement points, dictate the tempo of battle, and chase retreating opponents. This endurance was not merely mechanical. It became psychological. German crews calculated fuel, worried about strafing, and hesitated, the tiniest hesitation magnifying vulnerability. Technology had created space for tactical dominance. USAAF commanders quickly recognized the Mustang's potential. Brigadier General Jimmy Doolittle, among others, recalibrated mission planning to integrate long-range escort tactics. Squadrons were restructured, flight leaders trained to conserve energy, patrol, and intercept systematically. The new doctrine emphasized aggression balanced with preservation. Mustangs were not sacrificial, nor were they purely defensive. They were the spearhead of a strategic evolution, protecting bombers while simultaneously dismantling the Luftwaffe's confidence and capability. Every raid became a chess match, not just dropping bombs on factories, but forcing enemy fighters into reactive positions where mistakes meant destruction. Experienced commanders were killed or captured. Younger pilots, already undertrained due to Germany's dwindling resources, were thrown into an environment where survival was unpredictable. The Luftwaffe had trained to strike, disengage, and survive. The Mustang had rewritten the rules. Combat became less about glory, more about endurance and fear. Men who had once laughed at Allied fighters now calculated every maneuver for its survival probability. This was not simply technological supremacy, it was moral attrition. Confidence eroded with every mission. The skies that had once seemed like German territory became contested airspace, a silent, unyielding battlefield dominated by persistence, precision, and power. And it was in this shifting atmosphere, where technology, tactics, and human experience intersected, that the stage was set for the moment when the war in the air would irrevocably turn. Spring 1944. The European sky was no longer a neutral canvas. It had become a theater of attrition, where every altitude, every cloud bank, and every sun glint carried consequence. On March 6, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched a massive bombing mission against Berlin. 400 B-117s and B-24s filled the skies above Germany, escorted by nearly 300 P-51 Mustangs. For German pilots, the operation seemed routine. They had intercepted formations like this countless times. Fighters climbed, positioned, and prepared for attack, certain that, beyond the range of known escorts, they could strike with impunity. They were wrong. At 15,000 feet above the industrial districts of Brandenburg, Mustangs loitered. They did not dive immediately. They watched, waiting for the German fighters to commit. And when the Messerschmitts descended, expecting to find defenseless bombers, the Mustangs struck. Dive after dive, they shattered Luftwaffe formations. Pilots who had been confident in their speed and armament found themselves outpaced in endurance, caught in the crosshairs of fighters that had not yet tired. German aircraft were destroyed in detail, one formation at a time, often on the return leg, a place once considered safe. The pattern repeated on March 24, when a raid targeted industrial plants in Leipzig. Luftwaffe veteran pilots later reported that it was as if the sky itself had shifted. They climbed, they attacked, they expected to disengage safely, and every step home was contested. Bombers that had previously been sitting ducks now had guardians that would not leave. Entire squadrons of Messerschmitts were decimated, often before reaching the bombers themselves. What made these encounters decisive was not simply firepower. It was predictability turned against the Germans. For decades, Luftwaffe strategy relied on fuel limits, rotation cycles, and attack windows. The Mustang defied all three. It was always present, always capable, and always patient. Airfield reports reflected mounting concern. Veteran pilots who had survived years of combat were either lost or forced to fly fewer missions. Training programs could not keep pace with attrition. Commanders on both sides began to understand that the balance of air power over Europe was tilting, not through sheer numbers, not through heavier bomb loads, but through endurance, speed, and relentless execution. By June 1944, during the critical raids supporting the D-Day invasion, Mustangs were escorting bombers all the way to deep targets, rail yards in Rouen, factories in Hanover, and oil refineries in Ploienti. German fighter groups, once dominant, were being forced into continuous engagement, where their own losses compounded with every sortie. The skies over Germany, once considered a sanctuary beyond flak and fighter reach, had transformed into a lethal gauntlet. The P-51 Mustang was no longer just an escort fighter. It was a predator, one that redefined the nature of aerial combat and reshaped the strategic landscape of the war in Europe. This relentless pursuit was pushing the Luftwaffe toward collapse. Entire wings of experienced pilots were being eliminated faster than replacements could be trained. Commanders faced the grim reality. The old tactics no longer worked. The Mustang had not just arrived in Germany, it had arrived to stay. By late 1944, the impact of the Mustang on the Luftwaffe was unmistakable. Experienced pilots had become scarce. Airfields that once hummed with activity now staggered under the weight of losses. The German air war was no longer about offensive interception. It was defensive survival. During the raids on Frankfurt and Leipzig in September, the patterns that had dominated the skies for years were broken. German pilots, accustomed to engaging bombers with limited escort threat, now faced Mustangs that dictated the terms of battle. P-51s positioned themselves above formations, forcing the Luftwaffe into head-on attacks, the deadliest angles. Energy tactics, once the Luftwaffe's strength, now became traps. The Mustangs dove, turned, and struck with precise timing, retreating only when the bomber crews were safe. The psychological toll was severe. Luftwaffe pilots reported that morale was plummeting, not because of bombs or flak, but because of the omnipresence of an enemy that refused to leave. Veteran commanders struggled to maintain unit cohesion. Training programs were disrupted as replacements were rushed into combat, often with minimal flight experience. The attrition of leadership, experience, and confidence compounded, accelerating the collapse of German air strategy. The decisive moments often occurred on the return leg, the home stretch that had once been considered sanctuary. Mustang pilots learned to track bombers beyond enemy territory, waiting until Luftwaffe fighters exhausted fuel or ammunition. Then, with cold precision, they engaged. Entire groups of German fighters were destroyed far from their bases, creating a feedback loop of fear and caution that limited further offensive sorties. By November 1944, the statistics spoke volumes. The Luftwaffe's experienced pilot cadre had been reduced by more than half. Aircraft production, already strained by Allied bombing, could not compensate for the losses. Strategic bomber missions faced diminished resistance in 1945, a stark contrast to the sky battles of 1943, when German fighters had dominated. Even beyond the numbers, the Mustang had reshaped perception. German pilots no longer laughed at Allied aircraft. The notion that daylight bombing could be challenged with impunity was gone. The air war over Germany was now a battlefield where endurance, patience, and tactical innovation defined survival, and the Mustang embodied all three. By December 1944, the pattern was clear. Wherever bombers went, the Mustangs were already there. The Luftwaffe could no longer control the airspace. Its doctrine, built over decades, had been systematically dismantled by a fighter whose range and relentlessness had rewritten the rules of engagement. Every mission was measured not in glory or kills, but in whether they would survive to see the next sortie. The Mustang shadow hung over every airfield, every formation, every pilot, a reminder that the skies of Europe had permanently changed. The impact of the Mustang was immediate, measurable, and irreversible. By early 1945, bomber loss rates had dropped dramatically. Statistical reports from the 8th Air Force show that B-17 and B-24 formations flying with full Mustang escort sustained losses of 5–7% per mission, compared to nearly 25% in 1943 on deep strikes without long-range fighters. The difference was not minor. It was transformational. Survival rates for crews improved, confidence returned, and operational tempo increased. German forces, by contrast, were staggering under cumulative attrition. Veteran Luftwaffe pilots, the men who had dominated the skies over France, the Low Countries, and the Reich since 1940, were increasingly rare. Experienced instructors and commanders had been killed or captured, replaced with hastily trained novices who lacked the tactical knowledge to survive against superior Allied aircraft and the relentless strategy that the Mustangs enforced. Airfield reports from Luftwaffe Command documented the shift in a cold, bureaucratic tone. Fuel shortages compounded by continuous sorties reduced effective engagement windows. Squadron strength fell below 50% in several critical fighter wings. Morale among units plummeted, evidenced by higher rates of operational refusal and aborted missions. These were not isolated incidents. Every German pilot returning from the Eastern or Western fronts could recount encounters with long-range Mustangs. A mission that began confidently often ended in retreat, failure, or destruction. The strategic calculus of the Luftwaffe was collapsing under the weight of consistent, patient American air power. The effect rippled beyond individual missions. Industrial targets in the Ruhr, Hamburg, and Berlin, previously defended by coordinated fighter sweeps, became increasingly vulnerable. American bombers could strike with greater precision, supported by escorts that effectively neutralized the threat of Luftwaffe interception. The Mustang had not only protected the bombers, it had shifted the strategic initiative decisively to the Allies. For the German war effort, the results were devastating. Experienced pilots were irreplaceable. and their loss meant that remaining air defense relied on younger, less capable airmen. Attrition rates accelerated. The Luftwaffe's ability to respond to Allied operations diminished, making subsequent raids increasingly effective and more costly for Germany to counter. Yet the Mustang's influence extended beyond statistics. It reshaped the very nature of air combat. The once predictable rhythms of interception, the assumed sanctuaries along return routes, and the psychological dominance of the Luftwaffe were all upended. German pilots faced a new reality. The sky belonged to no one, and survival required more than skill. It demanded luck, endurance, and an understanding that the enemy could follow, strike, and persist far longer than they ever could. This relentless pressure left the Luftwaffe with a stark choice: confront the evolving air threat and risk total annihilation, or withdraw and cede strategic control of German skies to the Allies. By late 1944, the decision was no longer theoretical. By the closing months of 1944, the consequences of the Mustang's dominance were undeniable. German air defenses had been systematically worn down, not only through direct combat losses, but through the erosion of experience, morale, and operational confidence. Entire fighter wings were reduced to skeleton crews, incapable of mounting coordinated attacks against the ever-present American bombers. Industrial reports confirmed the shift. Critical war factories, aircraft plants, ball-bearing factories, oil refineries faced uninterrupted bombardment. While production continued, the cost in disrupted operations, damaged infrastructure, and lost skilled laborers was severe. The Luftwaffe, once considered the backbone of German defensive capability, could no longer provide reliable protection. Strategic bombing became a near-constant, predictable force, no longer subject to interception as it had been in 1943. Casualty statistics underscored the toll. By December 1944, Luftwaffe losses had exceeded 10,000 aircraft in the West alone, with pilot attrition rates unsustainable. Experienced aces, who had once dominated the skies, were gone or fighting on secondary fronts. Replacement pilots, trained in months rather than years, were frequently destroyed before mastering the tactics necessary to survive. The American bomber crews, conversely, gained confidence. With long-range Mustang escorts, they pushed further into Germany, targeting transportation hubs, synthetic oil plants, and critical war industries. Losses were minimized, effectiveness maximized. This air superiority directly influenced subsequent operations, including the preparation for and execution of Operation Overlord in June 1944. The skies above Normandy were controlled, largely unchallenged, giving Allied ground forces a decisive advantage from the moment of landing. The morale effect extended beyond pilots. German commanders were forced to reconsider doctrine, shifting from offensive intercept to purely defensive measures. Training programs were truncated. Operational plans became reactive rather than proactive. By 1945, the Luftwaffe's strategic input on battlefield decisions had diminished almost entirely. It was no longer a decisive tool, but a depleted and beleaguered force struggling to survive. Ultimately, the Mustang did more than protect bombers. It reshaped the European air war. It forced German pilots into unaccustomed defensive positions, broke the psychological confidence of seasoned Luftwaffe veterans, and ensured that the strategic bombing campaign could continue with devastating effect. The relentless pursuit from escort fighters turned the once sacred return journey into a gauntlet, leaving a permanent imprint on both sides of the conflict. The American fighter that had once been underestimated had become a decisive instrument of war, changing not only the outcomes of individual missions, but the trajectory of the European campaign itself. The story of the P-51 Mustang is not only a tale of machines and tactics, it is a story of endurance, adaptation, and the relentless interplay between human ingenuity and technological evolution. For the Allied air crews, it represented hope and survival. For the German pilots, it became a measure of fear, attrition, and inevitability. A single aircraft, once dismissed as inconsequential, had altered the strategic balance of an entire theater of war. The Mustang's endurance allowed men to push farther, fight longer, and survive where before they would have perished. It transformed doctrine, reshaped air campaigns, and forced adversaries to confront a reality in which previous experience and confidence no longer guaranteed safety or success. Yet the victory it enabled came at a cost. Thousands of men, bomber crews, fighter pilots, ground personnel, paid in blood for the air superiority it provided. Every tactic perfected, every engagement won, carried the weight of human lives and loss. In historical perspective, the Mustang illustrates a timeless principle of warfare. Adaptability and innovation can redefine the rules of engagement. Endurance, both mechanical and human, can shift the tides of conflict. And sometimes, a weapon is most powerful not because it destroys, but because it enables others to survive and succeed. The P-51 did not merely accompany bombers. It chased, it protected, it transformed. Its shadow over the Reich marked the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe, a turning point as decisive as any battle on the ground. History remembers the Mustang, not for its sleek design or its speed, but for the unyielding presence it brought to the skies and the irreversible change it imposed on the course of World War II. In the quiet aftermath, when the guns were silent and the smoke cleared, the lesson remained clear. In the relentless calculus of war, persistence often outweighs raw power, and endurance can become the deadliest weapon of all.